What do we find at the intersection of faith and the world? Our new podcast, Crossroads, explores this question in thought-provoking conversations featuring guests from around the world who are seeking to live faithfully in the public square. This is a safe space to discuss politics, technology, and our responsibilities as citizens. Pull up a chair and meet us as we search for a better way forward. Welcome to Crossroads, where we discuss the intersection of sacred and civic. I'm your host, Joe Nygard Owens. Today, I'm joined by former Secretary of the Navy and honorary Cathedral Canon, John Dalton. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much.
Also with us today is Raleigh Duttweiler, Chief Impact Officer at the National Military Family Association. This organization works to support military families and the unique challenges that they face. Raleigh herself has faced these challenges firsthand when her husband was deployed. Welcome, Raleigh. We're so glad you're with us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
And today we are recording from our cathedral offices in Washington, D.C. So, John, you wrote a book and you started to tell us before we got on air a little bit about it, especially the subtitle. Well, tell us the full story.
Well, this is my memoir, and I loved writing it, and it was a big task. And my wife, Margaret, says if I decide to write another book, it's going to be with another wife. So
those are probably wise words.
I'm not writing another book. And anyway, the subtitle of the book is My Journey with Family, Faith, and Friends to Calm the Storms of Life. And they have been there for me, family, faith, and friends all my life. And they've been there with me through tough times, and they've been there with me for delightful times, and I praise God for my life.
Well, your life has been filled with service. You had a time in the Navy, and you also served as the Secretary of the Navy, and you serve here at the Cathedral as an honorary canon, lay reader, and patron. So how do these different types of service relate, and do you have any advice for people who might feel called to serve and are discerning how to use their gifts?
Well, I would say lead ethically, and if you're truthful and fair and honest, you have no problems. You'll have problems, but they're achievable. You can overcome them.
Thanks, John. When we have sure footing, we can respond to problems that arise in life. So, Raleigh, you have personal history with military families. You work with military families all over the country. How do you see faith impacting our military families?
Well, it's in this context, I will take off my National Military Family Association hat, which is not a religious organization, but we support all military families. And that means that we support people who believe, people who don't believe, people who have found themselves at church for food pantries, who have found themselves there for pumpkin fests, and have been engaged with so many of us who are called to serve because of our relationship with our faith. And one of the things that we say at NMFA is that military families serve too. And so when I think about faith and service, I think so much about the things that I have learned growing up in a military family, the skills that I have had to develop in my own marriage and raising 3 military kids and supporting a service member through some of the hardest parts of what war can throw at a family, and how I bring that to my community. But that's really something that I have seen demonstrated for generations before mine, from the military family that I grew up in, from the women I saw raising kids through deployments, being single moms while dad was overseas, finding ways to build community. It's the family and friends in the hardest parts of life. And I think that when I think about faith, I have 3 kids, and one of them is very, very faithful. And she always has been. Like, she was the kid who at 2 wanted to understand the idea of God as a parent and how God would relate to Jesus as a parent and how that made sense in her little head. She's a kid who, after her dad's first experience with sort of a PTSD episode in her own home, came downstairs and said, "Mommy, I want to call our pastor." And she was little. And I mean, do you have kids? So,
We
right.
do.
Like I don't think the pastor is going to know intimately like, where your little heart is today, let alone what we're dealing with. Our family is a reserves family now. My kid's dad used to be active duty, but he's now in the reserves. And so by the time PTSD had really opened up doors in our family life, it was away from the support system of a base and an installation and like the cultural competency that we could rely on, where people looked at it and said, "Oh, I know what this is and we know how to help." This was sort of in the wild in Cleveland, Ohio, where the veterans we knew were people I was related to who couldn't identify it in the same way. And that morning, this like morning after our first experience with PTSD, she came downstairs and she said, "Mommy, I want to call our pastor." And I looked at her and I was like, "That's a great idea. We should totally call another trusted adult in conversation. How about grandma? How about like one of your uncles? How about literally anybody who has any idea of what our family is going through?" And she said, "No, I want to call Pastor Lindsay because my heart is tired." And she knew who to go to with a tired heart. And I think that that's like the interplay of faith and service, particularly for military families, is faith, whatever it is that like gets you up in the morning and keeps you going in those hardest times. That's the way that we then can stand up and serve each other. And I think in the military community, I don't know what it's like to put on the uniform. I have a lot of family members who've done it for generations. And inevitably, one of the kids in my home, if not 2 of them, will too. But I know what it's like to be on the supporting side of that and to be that infrastructure that keeps our community strong through really hard times. And all of that is an act of service. And for so many of us, and in my family in particular, that is one that is grounded in faith.
Thank you for being so vulnerable and open with us. Because the reality is that it's not easy to serve in the military and to integrate back into life after what has been seen and experienced, especially on deployments. And faith can be that anchor that helps to hold us steady in the troubled times, the wavy seas that rock us. But if we have that anchor of faith, we have a much better chance of staying steady.
Absolutely.
And I'm so intrigued. We were chatting also before we went live that you were sharing about a couple of last year's acolytes who have gone on to military schools. Tell us a little bit more. That is an amazing intersection of faith, military, and the cathedral.
Well, the head acolyte is now a midshipman, and I wrote a letter for him to help him get admitted and swore him in on the first day. And he called me this week to thank me for what I'd done for him. And I said, "You are an ideal midshipman, and the academy should be calling me to thank you for all you're doing."
What a legacy to have these young people who are coming up in the cathedral, and then to see your times of service and others within the cathedral community. And the cathedral has such a history of honoring our veterans and those who have served in the military and are currently serving. What a legacy it is to have some of our young people who have served the cathedral go on to the Naval Academy, to West Point, and other places to continue this.
His name is Jackson Wilson, and he did a great job at the cathedral and is doing a fine job as a midshipman.
I can't wait to see him at Christmas when he comes home. So this is to both of you. How do you think our churches, because we have people listening from all over the country, all over the world, how can our churches and even individuals support our military and their families through faith, through services? What is it that we can do?
I try to love my neighbor as myself, and I try to lift others up and treat everyone with dignity and respect. And those are the pillars for me in dealing with other people. What do you think?
I think that those are exactly the tools that we need people to be using to see military families wherever we are. And I think that it is so easy to sit down on Sunday in a pew and not realize that the family next to you is experiencing military service or that their family might have been marked by it. Less than 1% of America serves. So when we think about who those families are and how we can support them, step one is to love your neighbor as yourself and to look at them and think about what they might be going through. And we're here, we're in your communities. We're not just at Lejeune or at Naval Base Norfolk. We're not just in San Diego or at Fort Riley. We are wherever you are. And for our Guard families, reserve families, families on recruiting duty, families working in small posts throughout the country, we need you to know we're there and that our experience is just like yours plus some. And that's where like military life is really great. It is also really, really hard sometimes. And this is part of why when we talk about service, I mean, we talk about like the thank you for your service. It's so much more than that yellow ribbon. It's seeing us and acknowledging us. And I think about my kids in particular. They need somebody to look at them and know that it might have been a couple weeks since they've gotten a hug from their dad and that they maybe just need like somebody to put their arm around them and tell them they're doing a good job, that it just helps to hear from somebody else. But that's sort of the surface level stuff, is the seeing us and knowing we're there. What would be really incredible is if we were able to take our faith and let it guide us into some of those harder conversations about the experience our military families are having. At NMFA, we do a lot of work with military families in community. We represent them, of course, on the Hill and at the Pentagon, but so much of what we really do is serving families where they are. And we have families who are thrilled to keep serving this country, are thrilled to have children who might consider serving this country. And that's through financial instability. It's through food insecurity. It's through PTSD and the visible and invisible tolls of war that come home. And when they come home, that service member doesn't just come home and things are suddenly fine. There's a family that absorbs that support system. And when the family is doing that, those kids can take on additional roles at home that might not necessarily be seen. So we talk a lot about what are called hidden helpers. And that's this great name that we have given to these kids who are working in a caregiving capacity for a wounded, ill, or injured service member or veteran in their home. And there are millions of them across the country. I have 3 of them, and they aren't helping change bandages or helping dad walk. Dad does all these things by himself. But what they have learned to do is to see some of the warning signs of PTSD episode, to look for how to be careful to like not say something that might change the emotional tempo of a situation. And that's hard work for a little kid to do, but it's also the way they serve. I mean, it's not like you never grow up and think, wow, I really want my kids to do extra work. But this is like having grown up in a military family. You talk about the moments that you were drawn to faith. For me, I grew up in a military family and wanted nothing to do with it ever again. I moved to New York City and I was like, enough of this. I am going to go be a great reporter. I am not going to marry into the military. I'm never going to live at a base. I will never be a military spouse.
Tell God your plans.
And pregnant with 3 kids. And sooner or later, a handsome young Marine showed up and he just kept showing up. And he was so handsome and so charming. And I loved him so much. And then I ended up married at Camp Lejeune and pregnant and looking for work, as every Marine Corps spouse has at once been. But all 3 of my grandfathers served in World War II, and I had a step-grandfather thrown in there. And so everybody I knew for generations had served. And when my mom's dad, who was career military, his career Army, when he passed away, we went to the funeral, and obviously we went to the funeral. It was me and my grandmother and my mom, and my dad came. And I remember thinking, I have no idea what this is going to be like. Like, who shows up to this? This was sort of my first funeral that I was kind of taking in as an adult, but like a kid, but like, an adult kid. And I was in college, and I was blown away when I stepped out to get some coffee. I just I was struggling with how to support the women in my life who were grieving. And I walked back into this room, and it was standing room only. All of these people that I had never met, I hadn't even heard of, who'd served alongside my grandfather at various points in his career, showed up. I mean, there were just people left and right shoving their hands in my faces and saying, your grandfather changed my life, your grandfather. And I'd always been so proud of him, but this was something where for the first time I grasped so much of what this service was and so much of what this meant to be part of this family in a way that I'd taken for granted growing up. Like, it was just the life I knew. I didn't think anything of it. And then all of a sudden I saw how exceptional this service was. And so when we talk about those families and community, we often look at how exceptional service is and think about how great that is. On the inside, it just feels normal. And that's where having people who can stop and recognize that service can completely change a kid's life. Even in my 20s, it changed mine. So see us, we're here.
I think praying for the service personnel is great, and their families, and always thank them for their service and sacrifice, big time.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say that at my husband's church, every week in the bulletin, it lists servicemen and women who have connections to congregation members, and we pray for them. And I always make sure to look at the names, and if I can, see who the connection is, and just try to follow up. If I see a name that has been on there for a few years and it's not there anymore, where are they now? How are they doing? So I love having them in the bulletin each week and as part of the prayers.
I love that so much. And I had no idea that they were doing. So the only churches that I've ever been to that did that were ones near bases. Steens Ferry Presbyterian Church. There were the years that we were there, it was in the height of the wars, and there were just the pages of people deployed that you're praying for. I mean, just page after page. But since we left active duty, I have not been to a church where that has been something other than an afterthought on Veterans Day. And it has been really hard to have kids navigate deployments when nobody else is experiencing that or even aware of that. I love that simple act of awareness and prayer.
Yeah. Well, and here at the cathedral, this is the other side of that, not for active service folks, but we do have the honor roll. Are you aware of this, John?
No.
So we have the roll of honor where people who have served in the military, they can be alive or have been deceased, and people can go online and submit names, and they get added to the roll of honor for the cathedral, and it's placed in War Memorial Chapel. So remembrance and tribute to those who have served our country, it's built into the very fabric of our cathedral. We have carvings and stained glass windows. We have the kneelers, a cross made from the stone of the Pentagon from 9/11, and of course, War Memorial Chapel. So do these tangible reminders speak to you in any way as you worship here regularly, John?
I love the military chapel. That is a favorite place for me, and to see that display with all the services is really special, and I really appreciate that.
Yes. And we have services throughout the year with our branches of our armed forces. We just had a service.
Today's Air Force Day, birthday.
Oh,
Happy birthday, Air Force.
they had their service on Sunday, so that all ties together. And for those of you listening, we are recording a few weeks before this episode drops, so everything won't quite match up on today being Air Force Day.
When does this drop?
This drops just after Veterans Day.
Which means that we owe the Marines a happy birthday, Marine Corps.
Absolutely.
Devil dog birthday.
Excellent. Well, as we are wrapping up, we always ask our guests about hope. And where do you find hope for our military members, for our military families, Raleigh? What is the hope that you want to offer folks?
Hope springs eternal. And I love hope and faith and service. It all goes together for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I find so much hope in community. When NMFA started, it was 55 years ago. It was 1969, the height of the Vietnam War, and 5 military spouses got together at a kitchen table here in DC, determined to do better by their widowed friends. They put on their gloves, as was the era, and went to Congress and knocked door to door. And a couple years later, the Survivor Benefit Plan was born. When NMFA started, we were the only ones in the room saying, "What about the family?" I love that now I'm going to go to an event tonight with hundreds of other organizations asking the same question. We are no longer alone. We do it in community. I feel so much hope every time I get to gather with other veterans, service members, their families, and champions of our military family community that are committed to making life better for those who are committed to service.
Thank you.
I had the privilege of having the Protestant lay leader when I was a collateral duty for 2 of my submarines that I served on, and I got to conduct worship services when we were underway at sea, and that is a highlight for me.
And speaking of submarines, I hear there is a submarine that will be named for you.
That's true, but I salute Carlos del Toro, who made that happen. The Secretary of the Navy has sole discretion of naming ships and naming sponsors of ships, and Margaret is the sponsor of the USS John H. Dalton.
Thank you, Margaret. She's in the room with us here.
I love the idea, though, that there you are, and like in the middle of doing all of the work of military, that you get to still stop and take that moment to recenter yourself in faith. I love that.
Well, I loved it too, and I cherished the opportunity to serve as the Protestant lay leader.
What a gift and a treasure. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Raleigh, both for being here today.
Thank you for having us in
You bet.
conversation.
Thank you very much for what you do at the cathedral, and we're grateful to you.
Well, it is always my pleasure. I am so thankful for this important conversation on the role of faith for those serving in the military and the families who support them. On our next episode, we welcome Peter Wenner, writer at The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. We'll be talking about faith and values in our post-election world. Thanks for listening to Crossroads, and until next time, peace be with you. If the digital offerings of the Cathedral enrich your daily life, please consider becoming a supporter today by making a gift at cathedral.org/inspire.